Hi guys, I'm discussing this book called Think Again by Adam Grant today, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, and I look forward to sharing my insights on it. So, when was the last time you changed your mind? When you change your mind often, it leads to new beliefs, revised opinions, revised beliefs, which helps you have better chances of success. Book Think Again is divided into three key sections. The first one is on individual thinking, updating our own views. The second one is on interpersonal thinking, which is about opening other people's minds. And the last one, being collective rethinking, is about creating communities of lifelong learners. I'll be discussing the first one on individual thinking now. So, updating our thinking process is like updating our smartphone, our very old smartphone, like 5-year-old smartphone or 10-year-old smartphone. If we won't update our smartphone often, we know it will be prone to crashing, it will be slow, and it will lead to communication challenges. Just like that, what prevents us from upgrading our way of thinking? It is the overconfidence cycle that we fall trapped to or we fall prey to. That is why we don't update our thinking process often or don't update our thinking often. So what is overconfidence cycle? Overconfidence cycle gets triggered when there is pride as a base, which leads to opinion, which leads to many opinions, whereby we want to feel right, then we are actually being right, and we get validated by way of that. The cycle gets carried on and on unless we realize what is happening with us. Other than the overconfidence cycle, what comes in the way of sabotaging our thinking process is basically the three modes that are being talked about in the book. These three modes are preaching mode, prosecuting mode, and politicking mode. Some of us are actually we are part of these modes sometimes at one point in time, sometimes at different points in time, and sometimes we're actually wearing all of these hats together also. It depends on the situation as well. The preaching mode is when we preach for what we think is right. It may not necessarily be right, but we think and we preach for it to be right. Prosecuting mode is when we try to build up stories or cases against those who we think are wrong or are at fault, and hence we need to prosecute them. And politicking mode is when we want to belong to a certain group or want to associate ourselves with certain people, and so that's why we want to share and talk about what they talk about and what they sort of share, so we can actually belong to that group as a politician. These are the three modes that the book talks about and says and asks us to be very, very, very careful and be wary of, because these modes also actually prevent our thinking process or rethinking process and come in the way of our updating our views often. So what should we do if we can't be overconfident in our rethinking process, if we can't be wearing one of the three hats that I just talked about, the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician mode? What can we actually do? What we are advised to do in the book is that we need to start thinking like a scientist, wear the hat of a scientist. The book talks about two groups of students who were asked to take up a course on startup strategy in their management degree, and the two groups operated differently in the way that one group actually operated or thought more like a scientist when they were taking up this course on startup strategy. They looked at it as theory, they looked at customer interviews as hypothesis, and they looked at minimum viable products as experiments as compared to the other group. What later was found out that the group which actually acted like a scientist actually pivoted more often and were able to generate more total revenue for the year than the other group. As a scientist, we are part of the rethinking cycle where the humility takes precedence over pride. Doubt takes place of conviction, curiosity takes place of confirmation, desirability, bias, and then discovery takes place of validation. That's how the rethinking cycle actually flourishes or thrives more as a scientist or in a scientist mode as compared to the overconfidence cycle that thrives in a preacher mode or a prosecutor mode or a politician mode. We need to remember the smarter we are, the harder the chances that we'll fail, because we think we know it all. But when we are actually thinking like a scientist, we know that we need to experiment. So, armchair quarterback syndrome is when our confidence exceeds our competence level, and the imposter syndrome is when our competence level exceeds our confidence level. What we need to do is that we need to find the right sweet spot of confidence and not act like either one of the two, which is armchair quarterback syndrome and the imposter syndrome. How we can actually do it? This happens as can be seen on the grid here on the right side of the slide. When the belief in our tools is uncertain, but the belief in ourself is secure, that is when we gather or gain confident humility personality. That is when we know that we are humbly confident and able to think like a scientist, to be able to pivot more often and experiment more and discover more. So the book also talks about the psychology of constructive conflict as part of Good Fight Club, which is covered in the section of updating our individual thinking. As you can see on the slide, there are two graphs mentioned, one that of a high performing group and the other that of a low performing group. Those who were part of the high performing group tend to have more task conflict or as compared to relationship conflict. As you can see, the line of the relationship conflict stays fairly low in the graph as compared to task conflict, which sort of goes through peaks and valleys as the situation emerges, as a project emerges. On the right side of the slide is the graph of low performing groups. You can see that the relationship conflict line seems to go through peaks and valleys, and it's exactly the opposite of the task conflict line that is shown on the left side of the slide, in the left side, the left graph. And hence you can see here they struggle with more relationship conflict as compared to task conflict as well. The book talks about the case of Wright brothers, who came up with an aeroplane, who invented aeroplane, and how they actually were part of the high performing groups as they had higher task conflict as compared to relationship conflict. So this brings us to a summary of the first section, which is on individual rethinking. The summary says that we need to develop a habit of thinking again, which is we need to think like a scientist more often and not wear one of the three caps or modes that I talked about: the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician mode. We need to define our identity in terms of values, not opinions. And we should not associate ourselves with opinions. In fact, should keep revising or updating our opinions, whereas one thing that can stay the same is our values. We need to seek out information that goes against our views. That is when we can be less wrong next time, and that is something that happens when we are actually thinking like a scientist. We need to calibrate our confidence. We need to be very, very careful with that we don't get stranded at the summit of Mount Stupid. That is a possibility also, because people think that they know it all when they actually don't. Need to harness the benefit of doubt, because then that leads to discovery, experimentation, and finding, and embrace the joy of being wrong. And invite others to question our thinking also. Learn something new from each person we meet. We need to have a challenge network. Support network is important, but we need to have a challenge network that actually challenge our thought process, our conventional thought process. And we should not shy away from constructive conflict, because that leads to discoveries and experimentation, and that leads to new projects and products. So I'm now talking about the second section of the book, which is on interpersonal thinking. This section talks about two key things in the book, which is that we need to ask better questions. We need to practice the art of persuasive listening. That is when real understanding develops. That is when real learning happens, and that is when really people understand that it is in their best interest to be able to do things differently. Question how rather than why, and why is where the process stops also, of relearning or unlearning or rethinking. And ask what evidence would change your mind. Ask yourself questions of what changes, what do you need to see or listen to that would change your mind or your thought process. Ask how people actually form their opinion. Challenge their thought process, challenge their conventional thought process, so you can actually help them form a new opinion. That is where the revised opinion process flow comes in, and can actually lead to better thinking or updated thinking, which can lead to better chances of success. Lastly, on this section, the book talks about approach disagreements as dances, not battles. Don't look at them as fights. Look at them as dances that you're doing or you're part of, and enjoy the process of learning and unlearning and being wrong also. Remember that less is often more. Don't sabotage your thought process or your arguments by giving a weak argument. By giving many weak arguments, give one strong argument, and that one can be enough as well. Reinforce freedom of choice. Have a conversation about the conversation. Keep on doing conversations about the conversation, and because that leads to many different thought process also, that leads to change thinking also, and that is what the book aims to let us experience and have during this process. This brings us to the last part of the book, which is on collective rethinking, creating communities of lifelong learners. How can we do that? It's easier said than done, but if you follow a process, if you have a very thorough understanding or awareness around it, we can do it. One way we can do it is by having more nuanced conversations, more complex communications, complexify contentious topics. Don't shy away from caveats and contingencies. When you are having conversations, mention caveats, mention if this then that, if I'm saying this because of this and this and that. You can say that, you can do that, because that's what brings an opportunity, or that's what gives you an opportunity to have more nuanced conversation and expand your emotional range. Teach kids to think again as well. Have a weekly myth-busting discussion on dinner table with your children, with those around you. Invite them to do or have multiple drafts and seek feedback from others. Just, you will be surprised at what they can come up with when you invite them to go through revisions of drafts, or by having multiple drafts, because that's when real transformation happens. And that's what the book talks about, by giving examples of the drafts that the kids actually do also, and talked about. Stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. There should not be any limit to what kids should be or can be when they grow up. Create learning organizations. Abandon best practices. What is this term, best practices? Don't talk about best practices. There's no such word as best practices. Create learning organizations. Establish psychological safety, because if the psychological safe teams will be able to pivot more often, will be able to navigate more often. Keep a rethinking scorecard, and stay open to rethinking your future throughout the 10-year plan, 15-year plan, 20-year plan as well. Rethink your actions, not just your surroundings. And schedule a life checkup, very much in your, like, once a year, twice a year. Think about how your life is transforming, or how your life is evolving. Is it what you planned it to be? Is it what you aspired yourself to be doing? If it is not, think about it. Think about how you can do things differently. Think about how you would want to do things differently to be able to live a more meaningful, purposeful life, which is by way of which you are able to really achieve your dreams and have a successful life.